Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out tonight for our Neurodiversity Night, and welcome to those joining us online. I hope you're home in your pajamas. So nice. I want to start by just thanking all of you for coming and also thanking our presenter, Elise Wolf. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on Elise, and then we're going to get started. Elise has over 20 years of experience working with neurodiverse individuals across both public and private sectors. As a neurodivergent individual herself, she brings a unique perspective and deep expertise to her work. Collaborating with individuals, caregivers, providers, and organizations to develop customized tools and strategies that foster success in all aspects of life, including home, school, and the workplace. And we are super excited to have her here. She has a wealth of knowledge, and I'm happy that she's able to share that with us. So thank you, Elise.
Hi, thank you for hosting me. I'm also a Stoneham mom and the mother of a child on the spectrum. So I was very fortunate to have worked in this space because no one prepares you for parenting, but I felt like I had a little bit of a jump on some of the features of neurodiversity. So I feel really privileged that I have the opportunity to connect directly with parents and to bring all of those perspectives together. So what we're going to talk about tonight is neurodiversity from a couple of different angles. You will have access to a copy of this PowerPoint, which is fully accessible by screen readers. You will also have additional resources after tonight, a suggested reading list for kids, a suggested reading list for parents, and additional resources. Where you will find those, I'm very excited to share with you that thanks to incredible leadership from your district, we are launching a community connections page where there will be dedicated resources for parents, general education, special education, and otherwise. So look for more information about that this spring. And again, credit to your leadership. Also over here are a couple of different books to take a look at. This table right here is geared towards children of varying developmental ages and stages. And then we have parenting and teen resources. Feel free to take screenshots or any of those, but again, you'll get a copy tonight. Before we really get into the content, I really want to let people know that part of what we're going to talk about tonight is looking different is okay. And so tonight, if you need to move, you need to eat, you need to stim, you need to script, all of those things are more than welcome. And I want to just in advance thank you if you need to be yourself while we're together. The overview, we just did a lot of the welcome and some introductions. We're going to start off by talking about autism. Then we're going to look at it through the framework of neurodiversity, and we'll close out with how do you talk to your kids about who they are and about who other people might be in their circle. I would prefer to answer questions throughout, so don't ever hesitate to ask questions. I will remind people that we're recording tonight for the sake of accessibility, so if you do ask a question, we'll try to keep it in general terms. Excellent. So jumping right in, autism spectrum disorders. What you see on the screen here tonight are the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorders. The language here comes from the framework that we'll call the medical model. The medical model looks at the relationship between symptoms, challenges, and treatment, meaning lessening the negative impact of a symptom. I want to share that with you because we're going to contrast that to some of the other ways that neurodiversity lets us think about disability status. But if you look here, medical model language will sound like challenges, deficits, highly restricted, insistence, vocabulary that does have a bit of a subjective tinge to it when we think about here's healthy and here's disability. And that's the model that most importantly we need to release ourselves from. We're going to talk about how to do that tonight. In order to be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, you need to have all three of these following social communication challenges and two of the following in the category that we call restricted and repetitive behaviors. When we dissolved the label of Asperger's, which happened in the most recent version of our diagnostic manual, we needed to find a way to talk about the variability across the autism spectrum disorder. So when we moved to the model of a spectrum, If you think about a spectrum, the variability in what autism can look like and can feel like to an individual is one of the widest ranges in medicine. And specifically, one of the widest ranges that's captured by one label. So the way that we figured we would kind of sort that, we call it heterogeneity, or just kind of variability, is by using categories. So we broke autism down into 3 levels. We have level 1 that we call requiring support. We have level 2 requiring substantial support. And then we have level 3 requiring very substantial support. And while this was a little bit of progress in helping us figure out how do we talk about who a person is while being able to separate them from others and keep them attached to this autism spectrum label, this really helped us reframe that. And it's still quite subjective and doesn't allow us to capture the nuance within one person. So any one of us, disability aside, might require support in one area of life and require substantial support in another area. So this model in itself has some limitations. So the newest way of thinking about autism is a dimensional approach. A dimensional approach helps us acknowledge that there are shared traits that individuals with autism have, which is what allows us to give them the label of autism. Through our diagnostic process, we assess that someone has enough of these features that it results in an autism spectrum diagnosis. But this is becoming the more popular model, where we look at some of the domains of autism outside of that diagnostic criteria, but more driven by the experience of autistic individuals. We're much more, I won't use the word comfortable, but we're accepting that now we have to listen to autistic people more to better understand what autism is. And what that has resulted in us thinking about these domains of how you experience the world as a result of your autism, and that it may be that if we think about which of these domains most impacts you, impacts me a little bit, that we can actually create a multi-dimensional framework for someone's ASD. And that this is actually quite a healthy middle ground between the medical model and the neurodiversity model, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, this model does not yet exist in the medical community in terms of diagnosis or, quote, treatment. So you won't see this model represented in how providers would talk about or make a, quote, treatment plan for your child. But this, when I work with parents, this is a really helpful way to help you understand your child's experience, but then also to help other people understand it. So if you were to try to explain to someone your child using this slide, it's also not how you want to introduce your child to someone. But this paints a much more visible picture of who your child is so that we can better predict how to shape a world where they are more successful. And as we talked about tonight, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So this 3-level model doesn't allow the degree of nuance that a model like this allows. This allows us to still hold everyone under the autism umbrella and really individualize someone's profile in a very productive way. A couple of let's separate fact versus fiction pieces I like to share about autism. One is most often media representations of autism are of a more severe manifestation, meaning, let's go with the Rain Mans, or that kind of stereotypical presentation of autism. Someone disconnected from the world who speaks in a very strange manner and has superpowers. Those are kind of the pillars of those media representations of autism. And that's really colored public perception and understanding of proportionally what autism can look like. The reality is that autism is spread across cognitive domains, and 2/3 of individuals with autism do not qualify for an intellectual disability. So there's this implicit bias that lives within all of us that autism indicates. Excuse me, I get really excited about this. Oh, thank you so much. that autism indicates intellectual disability, when statistically it's just not true. So a lot of our work is in correcting media representation and showing greater variability within the spectrum. I also want to share what we call kind of related or tangential components that we understand about autism. And one of those is that we have an emerging understanding of the relationship between gender and sexuality diversity and the spectrum. It is statistically significant that autistic individuals are 3 to 6 times more likely to identify as gender or sexually diverse. And one of the most interesting things about this research is that it's a bi-directional relationship, which means it goes the first way. Autistic people are 3 to 6 times more likely. It also goes the other way. If you identify as gender diverse or sexually diverse, you are 3 to 6 times more likely to score higher on traits of autism. So we could imagine some hypotheses for why this is the case. Not conforming to gender norms, being really committed to your own truth. And we're still exploring what this relationship means. But I share this when I'm talking about autism to remind us of the literature about being affirming parents and who your child is and their identity, that if you have a child on the spectrum, could and should be something that your radar is a little more up for. Because we know that if you affirm your child's gender and their sexuality, that has tremendous protective and positive impacts on their mental health, their psychological safety, and it can prevent some of the more complicated needs that emerge when people don't feel supported, like, unfortunately, suicidal ideation, etc. That is a very quick overview of many years of studying autism. So before we get into neurodiversity, let me ask for any questions or comments or things I can talk a little bit more about. Yes. Yes, we'll just wait. Let me give you a microphone.
That's the nonlinear diagnosis, like making a map of someone like that. Do you actually make those for people?
Yes.
Yeah.
The question was, do we actually make these with individuals? Yes. I think it's hugely empowering. Our system is still very much so that when you get an autism diagnosis, people tell you about your autism. And I think any of us, if you have someone tell you about a dimension of who you are, it's not a great starting point for your introduction to helpers, right? So this can be hugely empowering. This also shifts over time. So it can also be really empowering for people to understand the relationship that maybe you started a support group or started working with a therapist or changed your wellness habits, met with a dietitian, and to reflect on how the impact of these domains shifts as you try things. You can also find this approach done for ADHD, because we're going to talk about this in a second, but there's a similar overlap in some of how you experience the world related to these components. Yeah, so it can be hugely empowering, and it also shows the fluid nature of who we are. There's a misperception that disability is one-dimensional and unchanging. And I think we have to be aware that there are some components of who we are that will be static over time, but there's actually a lot more that are dynamic, and focusing on the dynamic ones is often more empowering and I think healthier from a mental health perspective. Other questions about autism? No? No one wants to ask me the ABA question? No? Does anyone know the question I'm talking about? Okay. I don't mind throwing lightning bolts, so I'm going to throw some. There's a really big controversy in the world of autism right now about the use of ABA. ABA is applied behavioral analysis, and it is the only insurance reimbursable behavior support intervention for autism. It is not, but that's how it works in the insurance world right now. You can still get OT, you can get speech, and you can get therapy. But for example, you might get 40 hours of ABA a week and 30 minutes of therapy. So it's seen as, in the medical literature, the leading intervention when a child is diagnosed with autism. And the principles of ABA are, the controversy around it is that it's behavior modification. And I think when you look at that framework on a surface level, we could all imagine the response modifying your child's behavior might evoke in you and that your child might experience. However, the controversy is looking at the controversy only considers one small slice of what ABA is. ABA is actually the entire umbrella of what we know about human behavior when we change, when we're motivated to change things, when consequences do and don't motivate us. The entire body of literature around how humans are reinforced or consequenced and how that changes what we decide to do with our behavior, that whole thing is ABA. The controversy pertains to a specific piece called discrete trial training, which comes out of behavioral conditioning. This might involve a practitioner encouraging or prompting a child to touch red. And upon following through with that, they might receive points or credit towards an incentive, or in the moment, just a motivational piece, edible, or working towards a larger incentive. That very narrow component of ABA can often be perceived as leaving out the free will of the child and being quite restrictive. It is not often done that way, and there have been undeniably a lot of reports of ABA being used in a non-person-centered way, where we have pushed and at times forced individuals to change behavior in a way that the individual resisted or wasn't brought into. So we do have to acknowledge that is a piece of the history, and the way it's being used these days is that ABA is detrimental to children on the spectrum. And that we have to be very careful to not endorse, because that's not true. Because again, ABA is this entire umbrella. So that's a piece of that, and I think if you hear that floating around, it's a quite nuanced discussion, but it is really relevant, especially in special education. Questions? All right. Well, we will move on. So we're now going to transition to talking about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is a framework that emerged in the 1990s out of Australia, a woman named Dr. Judy Singer. She was a self-advocate, and she was, she's a sociologist, and she was researching identity trends. So she was looking at how a component of a marginalized identity, like race or gender or LGBTQIA+, how those historically marginalized identities were brought into more visible public consciousness when those people took control of their identity and were the people allowed to talk about it. And then that led to an enhanced understanding for the public, to legislation, et cetera, et cetera. And she observed that there were patterns to how that happened for all of these different groups. And her prediction was the next group is going to be mental health. She was right. So she coined the phrase neurodiversity. Now, chicken or the egg here, right? She coined the phrase neurodiversity because she wanted to find vocabulary that reduced the stigma of mental health and disability, as it was kind of colloquially referred to. Neurodiversity, the first word neuro refers to your whole nervous system. Often people think about neurodiversity as just the brain, but neurodiversity actually refers to the entire body. It's equally as much about the messages your body sends being interpreted by the brain and the messages your brain sends being acted out through your body. So I think that's one of the first misperceptions to think about is neurodiversity doesn't live just in your head. Neurological means your entire body system. And diversity refers to the naturally occurring biological differences among all of us. This symbol here, this rainbow Mobius strip, is the fancy word. The rainbow Mobius strip is the image that represents neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity are differences in how we think, how we feel, how we sense, how we communicate, how we understand, and many other dimensions, how we move, how we behave, how we perceive. When I talk to kids about neurodiversity, they can come up with an infinite number of ways they are all different from each other. And then when I go and I talk to corporations or hospitals, they're like, no, we're all the same. We're just the same. I'm fine. I'm just like this guy. Totally like her. So there's this thing that happens as we evolve where we receive messages that assimilation in behavior is success. And that's not entirely untrue, because the way my toddler behaves at home should not be the way he is in 30 years in the workplace if I'd like him to get and maintain gainful employment. But we have to acknowledge that part of why we're here tonight and doing this is that the time to talk about differences and solidify your child's perspective about that is when they are in school, before the world gets in there with their message first. That's what the tide we're trying to change. So neurodiversity is two things. It's a framework and a set of vocabulary. First, I'm going to talk to you about the framework. The framework is, well, I'll jump in with the vocabulary first. Neurodiversity is an umbrella term that often includes autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, dyslexia, OCD, and many more. People often ask me, like, does this one count? Does this one count? And my answer is, the goal of this movement is to be inclusive rather than exclusive. So it would be antithetical for someone to say, no, you're not welcome here. And we do want to stay true to neurodiversity, which means we should really be qualifying this as things that impact your nervous system. The perspective, and we're going to break both of those down further, is that historically, that medical model that we looked at defines differences as less than. And we even use words like comorbid, so that if you have autism, you knocked down one, you got ADHD too? Huh? Comorbid means like the pile-on effect, right? So it's pretty entrenched in all of us and our training, especially if you've had medical training, that disability is less than, and therefore treatment is looking to reduce the symptoms of your disability to make you okay again, I say with intentional tone. So neurodiversity says to counteract that, if we really want people to see difference as difference in a neutral sense, we have to actually think about strengths. So to get this idea of disability to disability, we have to actually talk about the inherent strengths that individuals with some of these disabilities experience that are not accessible to you poor neurotypicals, in order to more evenly weight the scales. Another core part of neurodiversity, which is why it's so critical in our schools, is it says that the environment, and teachers of people are inherently a part of the environment is what helps send those messages. So the environment, how it's set up, how activities are designed, how people treat you, can inherently exacerbate your disability or mitigate it, or allow you to show your strengths. That there's limitation to what the individual themselves can do to promote their strengths. The environment really has to take some ownership here, which is why themes like environmental design, universal design are so important in special education. Some other vocabulary to know. You've heard me use this word neurotypical. Neurotypical refers to an individual who is not formally diagnosed with or does not self-identify as having a disability, a neurological or developmental disability, a disability that impacts the nervous system. It's okay to use the word neurotypical. it's also okay to use the word neurodivergent. Neurodivergent is a person who either self-identifies with or has been formally diagnosed as having one of these disabilities. Divergent, because their experience of the world diverges from average. The neurodivergent population is still a minority, and that's an important piece to not let go of. Whoop. Whoop. I hear a lot of people with absolutely best intentions say we're all neurodiverse. And that itself isn't entirely problematic, but I want to share an analogy with you. Maybe 10 or 12 years ago, some organizations might have been proud to say they were colorblind. And since then, we've said, oh, sorry, our bad. We need to see color. We need to know that people have had different experiences. We need to know about systemic racism. So I give that analogy because when we think about we're all neurodiverse, we might be, in terms of all having naturally occurring differences, and those with a disability inherently experience more challenge living in a neurotypical world. So there's a possibility that message could be misinterpreted as minimizing the challenges of people with disabilities. So I caution people, I think it's used with absolute best intentions, but I caution people against taking that framework. So we have neurotypical and neurodivergent. The other thing I like to share is disability is an important word, and we don't need to be afraid of it. And it is not disempowering, it is empowering. It's a legal term that protects a historically marginalized and a minority class of people. Again, I think with best intentions, we have things like differently abled. Yes, and. Any questions about vocabulary? Great. So these represent are another way of us thinking about the relationship between the neurotypical and the neurodivergent world. We're living in a neurotypical world. That won't change. It won't, because statistically, minorities do not have the positions of influence to change the world that's been built by another one. So for some people, their experience of the world overlaps a little bit with the neurotypical world. Like I might be able to play some sports or be in a club with you or go to the same classes. I might even be what we call blend and faders, which is I can pass as not having a disability. Like you might not even know until I disclose it to you. Pros and cons to that. Other people, their experience of the neurotypical world is very far removed from their experience of the day-to-day lives. And I think we see this play out in special ed, right? In placement decisions, in the level of supports that a student needs to be comfortable and successful at school. So our current paradigm, just to recap, is the medical model focuses on deficits, disabilities, and a negative interpretation of difference. What we're talking about here specifically for neurodiversity are non-visible disabilities. Put a little asterisk there because you can definitely see my neurodiversity if you look. What we're flipping into gradually is recognizing those differences as a component of the diversity of our communities. That because people think and feel and experience differently, they have untapped insights that are strengths we haven't accessed yet. This is a link to a video that I'm not going to show right now, but if we have time at the end, we're going to come back to it. This video helps us think about how to teach kids about everything I've said in 90 seconds, which is not something I'll ever achieve, but she did, and it's great. The new phrase I want to introduce is neuroinclusion. This is cutting edge. This is like a month old on LinkedIn. So neuroinclusion says that we recognize neurodiversity, so we're promoting environments and people that welcome those differences through a strengths-based lens, which means a commitment of time and resources and training and learning and all of that. Neuroinclusion says that we acknowledge there are deficits, But we think about differences as a bigger category than we have historically. And in order to balance out the historical model of deficit, we have to intentionally push ourselves to find more strengths, to look for more strengths. But I want to focus on this category of difference for a little while. So differences, actually, let me ask a true or false question. Does anyone, I lied, it's not true or false. Does anyone know the year that was the first year, and you don't get to answer this question because you're trained in it, the first year that any general education teacher licensed to teach in the state of Massachusetts had to take a special ed course? The first year that to get a license to teach general ed in Massachusetts, you were required to take a special ed course? 2014. Anyone licensed to teach general ed in Massachusetts before 2014 was never required to take a single special ed course. Now, many programs offered them. So now let's think about the differential in training and exposure in our general ed systems. Now I'll ask another question. Does anyone know the year that the federal legislation saying you had to educate all children in your public schools was passed? IDEA? 1974. Which means if you were in school before 1974, or even honestly in the 15 years afterward, you didn't see kids looking different because they were out. They were somewhere else. Now let's layer in what we know about early childhood development. What you're exposed to in early childhood sets a critical framework for what you're okay with in life. So now think about how many professionals working in the world, in our schools, in our own families, were in school before 1990. When you put those two things together, you realize how totally ill-equipped we are, and how underdeveloped our systems are, and that we need to bring some intentionality to neurodiversity. So all the ways that people can look different in neurodiversity, it could be how well you organize yourself, where the binder that the rings, a binder is a thing where you open it up and then you used to put paper. Paper's made from trees. It's okay, you're an older group, I get it. How you organize. Your emotional regulation, how big you feel things or how bottled in you go. Your sensory processing, and your social communication. All of those things are some of the biggest categories of difference in neurodiversity. So if we think about this category of difference, let's look at some of these bullet points. You might know people in your life who need more or less motor movement, right? You might have learned at this point that they just kind of do that and it's harmless and it's just something that you have to deal with your own feelings around. That work that you did to learn someone who moves more or less is okay. You're okay that they're doing something differently around you. That internal work to be okay with someone looking different around you, now we have to do that an infinite number of times for all the kids on our caseload, for all the people that we work with, for all the people. So it's a lot of lift for neurotypicals. And you guys aren't used to working that hard, right? So we're asking neurotypicals to be more okay building out this differences category. Attention to detail. There might be versions of attention to detail that are a problem, right? So there's a kid in the class who won't let the class move on until we agree that that's cyan, not blue. And I'm going to hold the class hostage until we have all agreed that it's cyan. I've met those kids. I love those kids. But that's a problem. Now, there's a difference in having a different perspective on that and acknowledging, I think that's cyan and you think it's blue, but how far that goes could just be a difference. And the teacher choosing to say, yep, okay, it's cyan. And then we might go all the way over to strengths, which is that kid's knowledge of color. Now they go to art class and have social cred with their peers because of their knowledge of the color wheel. So there are other examples here, but really this slide is about us recognizing the work to expand the category of different, being truly neutral and being okay lives within the neurotypical community. There are things that need to live within the neurodivergent community, though, which is understanding when a certain behavior is problematic. It's unsafe to you, it's unsafe to other people. It's inappropriate, and there will be objective negative consequences because of it. So we also do ask neurodivergent people and people with disabilities to do a lot of work to change their own behavior, because it's not safe to continue that behavior in the world, or there will be objective negative consequences. So you see how much nuance there is into us all unpacking and rethinking our definition. I often get asked about this. My lovely Jewish grandmother would just go, nah, like, yeah, I noticed it, and like, it's probably not great, but also I don't have the time or the energy. She was one of 9. So meh is kind of like, yeah, I noticed it. It's probably not great, but we're not going to get into it. So now let's look specifically at autism. This is the same slide from earlier. This is the medical model. If we really want to push ourselves into noticing strengths, we can reframe disability to look for ways that someone's manifestation of autism is different and then is a strength. So here we have things like capacity to develop content expertise. Historically, we've talked about autistic people as having special areas of interest. I don't think that's fair, though, because that's saying I've watched a lot of Netflix. I've watched a lot of Netflix. That's an area, a preferred area of interest for me, right? It's different when you have spent time and energy and your brain allows you to learn more than the average person. So we're actually kind of condescending and infantilizing when we say it's an area of special interest. We need to move that into, this is an area of expertise. This autistic person has spent time and energy learning about this, and their brain let them do that in a way that a neurotypical brain can't. So that's one example of flipping our language where it could be seen as a microaggression. Having unique insights on assignments, heightened perceptual abilities, strength with repetition. These are areas of difference that we can actually push them into areas of strength. Here is an example of loyalty to peers or a group. Often in social prags instruction, I see people talk about having a wider range of friends. And when I hear that goal, I wonder if we're trying to turn a neurodivergent kid into a neurotypical kid. If that's a sneaky way of us getting at the medical model. A lot of the autistic adults I work with have 2 friends, and that's a lot to manage. I feel that way. Right? So loyalty to peers or a group, and when we're thinking about helping schools write goals for our kids, we need to look at them almost with a magnifying glass for microaggressions of neurotypicality. That's a mouthful. We're really quickly going to look at ADHD. So here's the medical model for ADHD. Up here, we have the inattention symptoms, and down here we have the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. Altogether, an individual must have 5 or more of these to be given a formal diagnosis of ADHD. Difficulty, restless, interrupts, forgetful, like pretty clearly a medical model, right? But if we reframe that through the lens of neurodiversity, how do we look for strengths to combat deficits? Divergent thinking. There's research that people with ADHD come up with 3 times as many solutions to a problem as neurotypical individuals. Now, we can see again that play out on the spectrum, because if you're in a work meeting and you want to play out all 13 of those solutions, we're going to be here a while. But if you have a manager that says, not in this meeting, but come talk to me afterward and we'll play them out, now we might actually tap into an area an asset to your team. Other examples are heightened attention for high interest areas and following in ideas and images. I'll give an example. I was working with an 8th grader in another district. A lot of my role is school consultation and helping schools introduce neurodiversity affirming practices. And I was observing this kid who was assigned a project, a PowerPoint on a national park. He was assigned a national park. It had a rubric, executive functioning, check, check, check. Teacher did a great job. The result was 38 pages on PowerPoint on one pack of wolves that lives in Yellowstone with images of each wolf. Like, we broke down the group structure, then we built it back up again and what they were each eating. There were scat photos. Really interesting. Not what the assignment called for. So that's an example of this spectrum again of, could we have taken that kid's interest and found a way to also help them meet the classroom goals? Yes, but it shows what a tremendous strength was available there. I also think that energy of ADHD, we need to run a lot of the jobs in our community. And so how we send messages to kids with ADHD about their need to move will either let them know this is a superpower and I can turn it into a career, or will lead them to have feelings about it that they may not want to embrace when it comes to thinking about it as an employment option later on. Any questions? We're really doing kind of a dense look at some very deep concepts tonight. Any questions so far? Okay. I'm just going to check online. Okay, thank you. A phenomenon I want to talk about for a second is masking. Masking is when autistic people or people with ADHD intentionally hide visible indicators of their disability to be better accepted in a neurotypical community. And the interesting thing is, autistic people don't do it intentionally all the time. So I often get asked, well, isn't this just social prags, like learning how to navigate the social world? The critical difference is that when you're intentionally using social techniques to maximize a positive outcome or to make a positive first impression, you know you're doing it. One of the challenges of masking is that autistic people and people with ADHD may not always know when they're not being themselves. And so we have to be really careful about knowing our kids and figuring out, are you doing this because you intend to, you're choosing to, or are you doing it because you don't know why, but you think you're supposed to? When it's true masking, the long-term impacts for the autistic individual are heightened anxiety, heightened depression, and an increased risk of suicidal ideation. Because they spent a long time trying to be other people, almost wearing the masks of other people, and that's left them underdeveloped in who they are. So a lot of our work in kind of a therapeutic capacity, working with individuals, is helping them figure out how to take the mask on and off, and how to know when they're slipping into it to pull themselves out. I see this a lot in elementary schools. Morning meeting, you go around the rug, what did you do this weekend? What's your favorite food? And the kids I'm there to watch will say whatever the kid next to them said. Now, other elementary kids are doing that too, but they might be doing it because they're saying, she said she likes Thai food. I don't know what Thai food is, but I like her, so I'm going to say I like Thai food. I like Thai food. But that internal process meant it wasn't masking. My kids are like, Thai food. I like Thai food. And there wasn't that intentionality of why you are mimicking someone else. So the last part of this section are just to leave you with some action items that you might want to change in your language. One of them is, we've already talked about this, the idea of special interests can be quite ableist. So instead, areas of expertise. Person-first language is the language that was drilled into us in graduate school. anyone who wrote a report or anyone was talking about anyone with a disability would say a person with. And that still applies to a lot of domains. But the reasoning behind that was we value the person first. The person comes first. Their disability comes second. What the autistic self-advocacy community is asking us to think about is identity first language, an autistic person. And their argument for that is you can't actually pull that part of me out. And some people would argue, I wouldn't want you to. The word treatment reinforces the medical model, so we might want to think about support services and strategies. Autism as a puzzle. The origins of that image, the origins of the puzzle piece image were from the Working Together to Cure Autism movement. That's a loaded belief that we would cure autism. So because of that association, many autistic people feel quite threatened by the imagery of a puzzle piece. Now, the organization that initiated this has done tremendous work to improve their relationship with the autistic community and to reframe the representation of the puzzle piece. So I don't think it holds as much of a negative charged energy as it has in the past. But I will say that when choosing imagery, it is more widely accepted and more positively accepted to use the rainbow neurodiversity strip. And then lastly, it's not comorbid, it's co-occurring. I think a great area to look for these is in your child's testing, whether it's public or private, and just to ask for certain shifts in certain language, especially where your child might read their testing or their IEP at some point. Yeah, question. Hold on.
At our child's school, children's school, there's a classroom that's the RISE classroom. And my kids will often say, it's a RISE kid. And I've been saying, that's a friend in your class that also has a RISE teacher, or they go to the RISE room.
Yeah.
I assume that's still up the right way.
Yeah. So the question was about other identifiers that kind of mean that disability relationship. I think you can think about it either way, because there might be kids in that classroom that own that identity. There also might be kids in that classroom that don't love it so much. So I think like this, we would never say, do it this way now. And I think, I think you can look at it in different ways. I often think about it as if the student would want to identify with that, then just have it come first. It's a RISE student. If we have some question there or we don't know a person in the RISE program, and I think it's like anything with identity where like pronouns, we ultimately want to listen to the person. There are a lot of autistic adults who hate this. But I think raising the visibility of this phrasing is just to counteract us being trained to always use this. It's just a gesture of returning the microphone to autistic individuals themselves. Yeah, coming with the microphone.
I had a question about how that language around medication and talking to our kids, and, are we call it his medicine, so I just wondered how you handle that.
Yeah, so the question was, what language do we think about with medication? I think medication is in some ways easier because it's about science. So one thing I like to encourage parents to do is if your child's going on medication, have the doctor talk to the kid about what it is and why. Some psychiatrists are awesome. Others are going to need you to say, hey, we're talking about starting my kid on this med. Could you please give them an overview of what they should expect from it, what part of their brain it impacts, and how they should expect it to change how they feel? And have the doctor do that first. I think the language about a medication will change blank about how you experience something in your brain or your body is a more objective framework. I hesitate to use the word treatment unless it's truly an area of discomfort for someone, which again, people with disabilities have. So we might say, this medication is going to treat components of your depression, which is targeted. It's not it's going to treat you. It's going to treat this acutely uncomfortable part of who you are. Does that help? Okay. Great question. So the last part of tonight is disclosure. How do you talk to your kids about who they are, and how do you talk to other kids about who your kids are? So we're going to do a couple of interactive exercises to keep everybody awake. I'm going to show you a picture, and you have to tell me what the next piece of the pattern is. Okay? You can just call it out. Next piece in the pattern. Blue square. Nailed it. They're going to get harder. Next piece in the pattern. I had to think about it. After this, I don't actually know the answers, so we'll crowdsource them. I'm going to trust you on that one. A down arrow? Great. I built this slideshow. Isn't that what parenting does to you? Some of us have given up. I maxed out on slide 4. It's 40. 2 people have said 40, so it's 40. So for these question marks, which one of these is it? B? We have a good vote on B? Yes, B. We've had 2 people say B. The answer is B. What is the yellow question mark? This is not a neurodiversity assessment. I'm not assessing you right now, for the record. We have an A. We have a C. What did you think? We've given up? Maybe a B? Okay, we've established at this point we're talking about patterns, so it's okay if we don't get this one as a group. This is a practice in letting go and moving on. So what we just did together were patterns, right? There were all different types of patterns. This is the framework I'm going to encourage us to think about when we're talking to kids about disclosure. Disclosure is sharing disability status, whether it's you telling your kid about theirs or you helping your kid understand others. Nature exists in patterns. This is called the Fibonacci sequence. Pull that out at 8 p.m. on a Wednesday. Nature has patterns. And if we link that to our conversation about the neurodiversity framework, and we go back to science, the way that makes us part of one of these groups, like autism or ADHD, is because our nervous system has a pattern to it. That pattern could be called ADHD. That pattern could be called dyslexia. That pattern could be called... So what we do with that framework is we don't take the person and separate them from other people. We say that there is a quality inside you that leads you to experience the world in a certain pattern. And that pattern has a name. Enough people have that pattern that there's a whole area of research on it. When we start to think about it that way, the initial experience of disclosure can actually be really validating for kids. Because kids know disclosure before we tell them. Kids know this kid is different. I'm different. And what we know about kids is when we don't give them an answer, they invent one. So if a kid has kind of learned they're different, they're going to invent an answer for why. And it's probably not a super healthy one. So when we get ahead of that and we help them understand they are part of another group, you're not another, you're not other, you're part of another. It can actually be a validating experience. I often liken this to postpartum depression. How an individual can feel like they're suffering in silence, and then that pattern emerges and a provider would say, oh, you're part of a big group. You're part of a very big group of people, so many people that there's a name for it, and we kind of know how to help you. So again, disclosure is the act of sharing personal information with someone. I think about disclosure in two ways. One is capital D, which is the conversation about a diagnosis. That's capital D disclosure. We're going to talk about how to think about that. But then there's little d disclosure, which is the kid who doesn't play at recess but stims around the outside. Your kids know who that is, and they're probably kind of cool with it, right? The kid who needs headphones because gym class is brutal. The kid who does not like to sit near the lunch line because lunch lines smell awful. So kids know when kids are choosing to do things differently, and they've actually kind of accumulated all of that data by the time we actually feel like we have to have a conversation about it. The journey of disclosure is not linear, not one time, not easy. It actually kind of looks like this. And, well, we'll get to that in the next slide. So when you are talking to a neurodivergent child about their profile, a couple of things to think about. We're going to break both of these down into what to do before the conversation, how to handle the conversation, and then what to do after you've had that initial disclosure. Before the conversation, if you're telling your child their diagnosis, you want to stop and think about, what's my goal here? Your goal should be bound by who they are developmentally, but also should be neutral. What information do you want them to take away from the experience? You want to avoid setting goals that are about their emotions. I want them to accept who they are. I think we've all learned by now in parenting that the control dynamic often goes the other way, right? We're being controlled by our kids. So think about, what's your content-based goal for having this conversation with my child? Then you do want to think about timing. When you're sharing a formal diagnosis with a child, I often encourage parents to think about an upcoming organic opportunity. Do they have testing coming up? Are they starting a speech group? Are they ending a speech group? Is April is Autism Month on its way? Think about a time that the world is going to deliver new information to them, and you have to think about how you want them to understand it. It's kind of like if someone's pregnant and having a baby. There's an event coming, and we want to figure out how to help our child understand that in a developmentally appropriate way. You also want to think about, what do you know about your child's language profile? I work with a lot of parents who do tremendous pre-work and have an agenda with bullet points about how they're going to talk to their child, and it's 2 pages long, single-spaced, and they're 4. And I'm like, oh, God, teach me how to have your kids sit for that long. So you're probably getting the sense that this dance of disclosure is really about you as a parent self-reflecting and figuring out, what are my needs in this conversation? And then taking the whiteboard and going to try to really make it about what your child's needs might be. When you prepare for the content, prepare for off-ramps. You don't want to go in with what you have to get through to have you feel good about this conversation. You want to be prepared for a couple of different times that the conversation can end that you'll feel okay with. And take care of yourself. We often talk about kind of the reckoning that a parent has to do when their child receives a diagnosis. Some models talk about a grief cycle, and I think that's relevant, but we call it kind of a reckoning. How do you as a parent think about and feel about your child's disability? I have yet to meet a parent, myself included, who was like, yes, this is unequivocally entirely positive and nothing challenging will happen because of this diagnosis. So that's probably not how you want to have this conversation. You also probably want to give yourself some compassion and not have it when you're feeling raw, when you're having a really tough period of meltdowns and you're not feeling good about your child having a disability. That's also not a great time to bring this conversation to your child. So during the conversation, keep the content brief and developmentally appropriate. If your child uses visuals to communicate, maybe work with an SLP or build your own sequence of visuals. A social story is a great way to introduce this to individuals that are non-speaking. Other ways that you can introduce it to your child are to say things like, we learned something about your brain. So this gets to my next theme about disclosure, which, in case I haven't hammered it home enough, this is the hat I wear when I talk with families about disclosure. The brain is a really healthy trampoline to use as the foundation for disclosure. It's not your kid, it's their brain, and their nervous system have a pattern. So when you're sharing a diagnosis, you might want to think about using the brain. We've learned something about your brain. There's a pattern to your brain. The way your brain sends messages aligns with a profile known as nonverbal learning disability. In the moment, you also want to give a lot of wait time. Use active listening. Reinforce questions. There's a strategy where you actually might not want to answer all your child's questions in that meeting, because then it looks like you have all the answers. A more powerful, long-standing approach is to empower their questioning, and that you're going to join together to get answers. What that sounds like is, you are asking great questions, and I don't know all these answers. So we're going to figure out how to get them together. That sets the framework that we're exploring this together. And we've already kind of talked about this, but if the child wants to opt out, let them. And then lastly, after, going back to that squiggly line, make resources available. There are some examples over there of books you just might want to casually leave on the counter, or come home in your library bag. As we just talked about, emphasize a journey of shared learning. Provide models of neurodivergent adults. There are some great TV shows. What's the raccoon one? Carl? Carl the raccoon. Sorry, I threw you on the spot there. It's late. And facilitate and promote participation in neurodiversity affirming events. So even if your child isn't totally there yet, you as a family might go to a neurodiversity celebration one town over. Or you might decide to watch a movie. So you're creating a family culture of exposure that at times will line up with your kids' questioning and at times will not. But you're bringing this framework into their visibility. So before we move on to how to talk to neurotypical kids, questions about disclosing a diagnosis to a child. It's heavy. It's heavy. Talking to neurotypical kids about disability has a lot of the similar themes, right? But a couple of more specific things to think about. This second bullet point, consider your own family exposure to disability. Have you watched the Special Olympics? Have you volunteered at the Special Olympics? This is not related to disability, but I find it always interesting that the bracket at my clinic at the hospital for March Madness only does men's teams. I know I'm working on it, but there's just a lot on my plate right now. But you'll see a lot of these are actually quite similar to the pre-work of talking to a neurodivergent kid about their disability status. This line right here, there's no time that's too early to start doing intentional exposure to people with disabilities. If you do one Google search, there are phenomenal YouTube videos of people in wheelchairs, people using AAC devices to communicate. Think about your child's exposure and just wonder, is there an area we could push more into so that their general exposure to disability continues to grow. In the conversation talking to a neurotypical child, your goal is not necessarily or not to confirm a diagnosis. That's where this is really different than talking to a child who has a diagnosis. Your goal is not to confirm, yes, this person has autism, yes, this person has ADHD, but your goal is to encourage them to think about that idea of difference, deficit, and strength, and that neurodiversity framework we were just talking about. The goal here is to help your child feel that their zone of difference is expanding and that it can make sense to them. Here are some examples of things you can say. There are so many ways people can be different. One way people can be different is how their brains work. The way our brains work leads us to behave differently. You know how sometimes when you're super hot in the car and you get super cranky? There are other people who might behave in a way because they feel that crankiness because it's too cold out, or because the teacher said something and they didn't like it, or they can hear the person next to them chewing. As the kid gets older, you can say things like, it occurs to me that there are probably a lot of kids in your class, and probably kids with disabilities. Do you ever think or wonder about that? So you're modeling that these are okay words. I think with best intentions, I hear a lot of people overthink this, and it sounds kind of like, it occurs to me that there are probably a lot of kids in your class. Probably, maybe even, it's entirely possible that some of those people that you sometimes interact with might occasionally do something that isn't the way that you would have done that thing. And do you ever think about why they might do the thing a little differently than you do it? Like, oh man, I talk a lot, and I could have said that in 30 less words. So modeling transparency. There can be a sensitivity to this. If we take what might be kind of a difficult example of a kid in a class being really sick, we might give that language clearly. This student is sick. This student has cancer. And we can give it with an emotional affect. Sometimes that can play a role in these conversations, and we're talking about different things here. So you do want to think about managing your affect and the messages your kid might receive from how you use your affect in conversations about disability versus illness. A responsive conversation, so this slide is all about if you want to start the conversation. This slide are ways you can do it in response to something. You saw a kid at the playground who looked different. There's a kid in your class that looks different, a new family member. You saw a movie and they had questions about it. In the same way that you might encourage or teach your child about LGBTQIA+. So this could be a responsive conversation. This example about the dog t-shirt, I was observing a student at a playground and a peer walked up and just held their t-shirt right in their face. And the other kid was like, oh my God. You know, eventually we will help this kid manage personal space, but this was a great way of handling it that we worked with the teacher. They really loved your dog t-shirt. I noticed they moved really close to you. I also noticed that they weren't speaking using words. This might feel new. And that's a different way of us seeing different. We're expanding our understanding of difference. And then very similarly to the after of disclosing to a neurodivergent child, here are some ways to just create a culture of exposure that's going to support your children. Question? Yeah. Sorry. Here you go.
Sort of the in-between where we're talking to siblings.
Yes.
And sometimes there's some jealousy over extra attention.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, so a great question about how do you talk to siblings about when someone has different rules. Yeah, I think that I often get asked, is it okay to tell the sibling before you tell the kid? Sometimes the answer to that is yes, depending on the age differential of your child and other developmental factors. I think that the sibling, in my experience, the sibling already knows, and they want you to tell them how to feel about it. So in that situation, I really think that validating goes a long way, and opening up the floor for, we notice that, our schedules as a family have been quite different. I'm making up names here, but, Peter often gets a parent all to himself all day after school. And sometimes we ask you to play on the computer. And sometimes you really want our attention, and we say that we can't, and give specific examples. And then open it up. How does that feel for you? And see what they give you. Sometimes kids will say, fine, because they're super flexible and they want to be good siblings. And then you could respond with something like, it doesn't always feel fine to me. And it's okay if it doesn't feel fine to you. Could we talk more about why mom and dad or mom and mama are making decisions about doing things differently? I think if they say, I hate it and I'm really mad, I say, I'm so glad you're telling me. This sounds like a conversation we should have, and maybe even some problems to solve. So it's inviting that conversation, validating feelings. I will say UMass runs a free sibling support group that is very well done. And there's a couple other sibling support groups in the area. The big picture of a very dense night together: disability is real. Neurodiversity affirming practices will save lives and make our community brighter. True inclusion is about curiosity, perspective, listening, and learning. And join your child in their experience. We also want to stay committed to facts about disability. That's really critical, that we don't get swept up in what I'll call social media, but it's probably a bigger umbrella than that. Carve out space for and value neurodivergent voices. And all of this is about process, not product. So thank you for being here and for being allies for myself and for our kids. We're getting close to the end of our time, but I'll open it up for any big picture questions, where to find resources, comments. And if anybody online has a question, please feel free to chime in and we'll get that answered. Yeah.
Carl the Collector.
Carl the Collector is the raccoon on PBS, and he's outwardly autistic. And it's really interesting, those dynamics. I also often use shows like Winnie the Pooh or Sesame Street to model neurodiversity. Like, would not be strengths-based to have Eeyore function as a cheerleader, right? There's a great book where Rabbit tries to stop Tigger from bouncing, and they learn that his bouncing is something they actually love about him, even if sometimes they need him to stop bouncing. So I think kids can actually get more nuance than we give them credit for, because adults don't love nuance. Questions? Allison, while you're typing, I'll just remind people of what we'll be sharing. So when the website gets launched, which is really exciting, really soon, there'll be the recording of this presentation, a list of recommended readings for adults, for kids, as well as a list of resources for general parenting, developmental milestones, special education, and disability education. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to those online. I will hang around and answer any questions, but look for more resources coming out. Thanks, everyone.